Episode 10. The Legacy of Gadwall. The London and North Eastern Railway was one of the so-called Big Four companies, formed during the 1923 Grouping Act in Britain. In this form, with engines from the North Eastern region and Great Northern Railways, it lasted a mere 25 years, but left an everlasting impression of luxury, prestige and speed. 40 years after the end of British mainline steam, these are the stories they tell.
The weeks passed. The engines of Copley Hill Shed said nothing more about the argument and carried on as normal. There were little changes here and there over the weeks after Scott's outburst. Stephen had been repainted into British Railways mixed traffic black livery. It was a handsome livery, and he wore it well, especially when he pulled his local stopping trains. Tavish and Herbert were spending a lot of time away from the yard and goods duties, while Nigel shunted it as usual, and Alan the A1 Pacific was enjoying taking his expresses daily. He'd often stop in the company of other express locomotives that would visit from time to time. I am sorry to say that Sir Ralph had simply stopped talking to any of the other engines. He went about his work looking increasingly forlorn and increasingly dirty. He didn't ignore the other engines as such, and would always whistle his acknowledgement of their presence, but he tried to stay out of the engine's way as much as possible. What on earth was Sir Ralph hiding from? No one had worked out exactly what Scott was talking about, save for Stephen, who simply smiled warily and puffed away whenever the engine started talking about the argument. It was on a dark, grey day that Sir Ralph and Scott found themselves in the shed next to each other. "So the impostor has returned again," Scott said, and Sir Ralph looked away sadly. "So have you come to your senses? Will you admit your guilt?" "I have nothing whatsoever to admit," Sir Ralph said quietly. "I am no impostor." "So you're a liar then too?" Scott snapped. The engines were horrified. "Scott, that's enough," Alan said, wheeshing angrily. "He doesn't mean it, Sir Ralph." "I most certainly do," Scott said furiously. "He is a liar and a charlatan, and the sooner the truth comes out, the better it will be for all of us." "How is he a liar?" Herbert said, not quite understanding. "He is not the real Sir Ralph Wedgwood," Scott said, and blew off steam with some fury. "He purports to be someone he is not." The engines all whistled and argued loudly, save for Stephen, who was looking very intensely at Scott. "Hey, that's enough!" The foreman had been watching from his office when the trouble began, and had made his way down to the yard as quickly as possible. "What is going on?" "Sir," Alan began, "Scott is accusing Sir Ralph of being an impostor." "He is an impostor," Scott said angrily. "He is not the same engine. He is not the friend I lost in York in—" "Actually, I am," Sir Ralph said quietly. "Only, you don't know the whole story." "That's right," Stephen said. "Scott, who do you think this is?" "Well, it's Gadwall, of course," Scott said furiously. Stephen looked at Scott in utter disbelief. How could he not know? "I think I'd better tell you what really happened," Stephen said, and the engines quietened down to listen to the story.
In 1938, the A4 Pacifics were earning their nickname, the Great Streaks, with some wonderful and consistent runs with top-end expresses on the old London and North Eastern Railway. The first batch had been named for the Silver Jubilee, but it was the second batch that had always fascinated me, with the engines named after birds: Mallard, Kestrel, Great Snipe, Herring Gull, and of course an engine named Gadwall. It was a splendid time. The A4s appeared in many liveries, but none so majestic as the garter blue and red livery that was soon adopted for the entire class. Before the war, a great man was helping to rebuild and indeed improve one of Britain's largest railways. His name was Sir Ralph Wedgwood, and it was decided in the March of 1939 that he should be honoured with an engine named after him. There were two A4 Pacifics that were considered, number 4466 Herring Gull and 4469 Gadwall. The two engines were great friends, very competitive and consistently sought to outdo the other. However, it was thought that Gadwall was in the better condition, and so it was that 4466 was to emerge in the March of 1939 with a new set of nameplates. Gone was Gadwall, and into the frame stepped Sir Ralph Wedgwood. After he was renamed, Sir Ralph remained a fine engine. Fast and punctual, he was admired by all, especially by his good friend Herring Gull. Before the renaming, the two engines had been a trio. They had been stabled at King's Cross with a very famous locomotive. His name was Flying Scotsman. I know this because I too, as a humble Holden B12, was stationed at King's Cross, and I would be working with them at York Sheds in the year of 1942. The three engines were inseparable, and many a time were they scolded for chatting to each other, instead of working their expresses. Then, in 1939, everything changed. Britain was now at war. The liveries disappeared beneath a coat of black paint. LNER became NE, and all of the railways of Britain suffered. Air raids, bombing, and mass migration from the east to the west coast. Aircraft were built and deployed in large numbers, and nighttime bombing on both sides commenced in the coming years. By 1942, the German Blitz on Britain had done much damage. The worst was yet to come. In retaliation to a British raid on a town called Lübeck, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, carried out their Baedeker Blitz. It was the towns of Exeter, Bath, Norwich, York and Canterbury that were attacked in these raids. Every night at York Sheds in 1942 we could hear the explosions and hear the aircraft overhead that night so clearly you could almost see them. It was a raid like no other, no end in sight, with fires raging on the horizon everywhere. Sir Ralph and Herring Gull talked earnestly. It was their way to avoid the sound of the bombs, to avoid the reality of war. They chatted. They talked about the golden days, before the war, and the runs that they would make after the war. It was the night of the 28th of April. The day had been long. The LNER had suffered badly at the hands of enemy bombing the previous night, and the trains had been badly delayed. Goods trains were given priority, and passenger trains were invariably delayed. They didn't mind, of course, the passengers. There was a war on, you know. The night of the 28th came quickly, but of course it wasn't the end of the A4's work that day. The Night Scotsman was waiting in York's Platform 9. It was Sir Ralph's turn to pull the train. The dusk had come and gone, and the sky was black as soot. Then the sirens came. Those dreadful sirens, signalling an air raid, and the bells that came with the fire engines started to ring through the streets. The station was evacuated. Passengers left the Night Scotsman and ran for the exits. Sir Ralph's crew left him for the safety of the bunkers. Sir Ralph was alone at platform 9. I don't know what went on in his mind that night. Why had he been left? Why did his driver not stay? What would happen to him? No one can know, nor will ever know. But I know, because I knew him, that he would have been dignified and brave to the end. He was that sort of an engine. I had been dozing off. It had been a long day. With the bomb-damaged lines and shunting in the station, I had been kept busy. Herring Gull was waiting for Sir Ralph to return. Suddenly, we heard a blast and a flash of light at the windows. Herring Gull and I looked, one to the other. The station must have been bombed. A direct hit. The fires burned dully. The damage had been done. When the morning came, and the light shone upon the land, I was taken by my driver to pull the remnants of the train from the station. We saw the devastation. There was a dreadful sight for us all. The sight of an engine, wrecked, and beyond repair. I could not bear to look any further. I took the coaches away and went back to the sheds. Wait a minute. Alan looked at Stephen questioningly. So Gadwall was the engine that was destroyed? Yes, Stephen said, and the other engines muttered amongst themselves. Under the name of Sir Ralph Wedgwood, of course. So, Alan looked towards the present day Sir Ralph, who was sitting on his road, quietly listening to Stephen's tale. Let me finish, Stephen said. By 1944, the bombing of British cities was almost over, and the directors of the LNER had made a decision. I was waiting on shed when an A4 Pacific backed down next to me. I knew him by reputation, but not personally at this point. The engine's name was, of course, Herring Gull. We started to chat, and eventually we came to the subject of the Baedeker Blitz and the bombing of York sheds. Herring Gull was missing the late Sir Ralph, formerly Gadwall, very much. I just wish his name would not vanish, he said to me one day. It's all so easy to forget someone who has moved on. I wish I could make his legacy live on in some way. Such loyalty to a friend had struck a chord with me. I introduced myself as Stephen, and since that moment we have been firm friends. Oh, we've never always seen eye to eye, but our mutual respect for those who lost their lives, and our loyalty to our railway and our country, has made us far greater friends than you can know. That afternoon, a man came to see Herring Gull. He was a kindly man, and his name was Arthur Henry Peppercorn. Hang on a second, Alan said, beaming. That's my designer you're talking about. Yes, Stephen said impatiently. I do wish you'd stop interrupting. Oh, Alan said, subdued. Sorry, Stephen. That's fine, Stephen replied. Please continue, Stephen, Scott said quietly. He had not spoken since Stephen had begun his tale. Well, Mr. Peppercorn went to see Herring Gull. Little did we know that this man would one day be the last chief mechanical engineer of the London and North Eastern Railway. Truly, he would see in the end of the LNER. Herring Gull, he said, you have done sterling work for us, and we are very proud of you. One of our members has suggested that you are worthy of a new name, but I wanted to talk to you before anything was decided. Of course, sir, Herring Gull replied. We had thought of renaming you Sir Ralph Wedgwood, as a tribute both to the man, my compatriot, and to your friend, the late Gadwall, Peppercorn said. However, I am aware this may be a sensitive issue. Thank you, sir, for your concern, Herring Gull said, but I can think of no greater honour than to carry his name. For you see, sir, his name will then live on. Mr. Peppercorn nodded and smiled. He understood. The renaming was not one of pomp and affair. It happened during maintenance in the January of 1944. One day he was Herring Gull. The next he was Sir Ralph Wedgwood. The two A4s had left Scott behind at King's Cross when they went to York. By the time the news of the disaster came about, Scott had been transferred and was working at Peterborough, New England sheds. He would not, of course, recognise his friend. He would not know which had been killed. He simply did not see them. The years passed, and he would never again see Gadwall or Herring Gull. Finally, in 1945, the war ended. It had come at a great cost. Over 60 million people, the majority of them civilians, were killed. making it the deadliest conflict in human history. 1.5 million people had been killed in nighttime bombing raids. The London and North Eastern Railway had a short life after the war, and in 1948, with the Nationalisation Act, the end of the LNER came, and with it, the railway began to rebuild and restructure for the tough times ahead. It was now the eastern region of British Railways. Sir Ralph, formerly Herring Gull, was transferred with me to this yard, and in the August of 1948 we met a young, unnamed Peppercorn A1 Pacific for the first time. But that's another story, Stephen finished. The long and the short of it is, Scott, he said, looking at the downcast A3 Pacific, Sir Ralph is indeed your friend, just not the friend you thought he was. This Sir Ralph is Herring Gull, and it was Gadwall we lost, Scott said miserably. The foreman saw that Scott and Sir Ralph needed to speak to each other, and began to order the other engines to leave. Stephen was the last to go, and whistled to Sir Ralph as he left. When the foreman returned to his office, Sir Ralph and Scott were alone once more. Sir Ralph broke the silence first. "I can see why you would think it was sinister," he began, "and I would have thought the same way." Scott let off steam sadly. "I only took Gadwall's name to keep his legacy going," Sir Ralph said. "It was a small comfort to me that I would be a living reminder of a great engine, a far greater engine than myself." "I know this now," Scott said miserably. "Can you ever forgive me, old friend?" Sir Ralph smiled. "Of course I can," he said, and whistled loudly. Scott gave a small smile. "I don't understand why you kept it so secretive for so long," he said. Sir Ralph kept smiling. "Sometimes," he said, "sometimes I'd like to think I'm channeling Gadwall's spirit, that he'd be urging me on in my runs, on my expresses. Why ruin a legend by revealing I was not the engine I was supposed to be? I did not want to taint his legacy." Sir Ralph paused. Now the truth would out. "A few months ago," he said, "I went to the works for repair. I had been grumbling dreadfully about the most petty things." His mind went back to Herbert, back to Nigel, back to Alan, back to Stephen. And he laughed suddenly, smiling, and Scott gave him a rather bewildered look. "I had lost my way," he said, "and I was even annoying the fitters with my twittering. Then I was taken into the workshop, and I saw, hanging on the wall opposite me, 2 sets of nameplates." Scott was intrigued. "The nameplates read Gadwall and Herring Gull," Sir Ralph said, "and I suddenly remembered why I had taken on Gadwall's name. I chose to honour him by carrying on his legacy. I had forgot my purpose, and in that respect you were correct, Scott. I was a cad." By now Sir Ralph's smile had vanished, and he was sombre once more. "I had betrayed my friend's memory. I vowed, there and then, to do my utmost to restore his honour." Scott smiled. "I think Gadwall would be very proud of you," he said. Sir Ralph smiled back. "The truth can be a very sensitive and difficult thing to reveal, but here, in the case of Sir Ralph Wedgwood, it was a release." The 2 engines are firm friends once more. Scott never forgets to whistle to Sir Ralph at the junction, and Sir Ralph never forgets to stop and have a chat on the way back from London. One thing is certain. The name of Sir Ralph Wedgwood may have lived on, but it is the memory, the legacy of Gadwall, the lost A4 Pacific, that stays fresh in their minds every single day.